To start today's video, let's take a look at data for people who have the same BMI but different levels of visceral fat. And that's what we can see here with the top and bottom images. So first, starting with subcutaneous fat, this is the fat that's located just beneath the skin, subcutaneous. We can see that the person at the bottom has a bit less subcutaneous fat than the person at the top. But what about visceral fat? So visceral fat is the fat that surrounds organs. And for the person at the bottom, as highlighted in yellow, we can see that the person at the bottom has very little visceral fat. In contrast, the person at the top has a lot of visceral fat. So why is that important? So as we'll see coming up, surgical visceral fat removal, at least in rats, extends median and maximal lifespan. So before jumping into the survival curves, it's important to show some of the details for this study. So visceral fat was surgically removed when the rats were 5 months old. And then at 20 months old, how much visceral fat was present? And that's important because this is a longevity study. So if they removed the visceral fat at youth and then the visceral fat grew back, then we really can't assess the effect of visceral fat removal on longevity if most of it, accumulated over time. So there were 3 groups in this study. A group that had their visceral fat removed but was allowed to eat as much as they wanted whenever they wanted. The group that ate as much as they wanted whenever they wanted, ad lib or AL. And then CR, more specifically 40% CR. So how much visceral fat was present in these 3 groups? For the group that had their visceral fat removed, they had about 9 grams left, and this is 15 months after the surgical visceral fat removal. So visceral fat didn't necessarily increase, or didn't increase much 15 months later, as we'll see in a bit. Then the ad lib group had about 3 times higher level of visceral fat when compared with the group that had their visceral fat removed. And we can see that that's significantly different because the superscripts are different, B and A, respectively, for the ad lib and visceral fat removed groups. But what about in CR? How much visceral fat was there? So they had 5.9 grams of visceral fat. And interestingly, we can see that the amount of visceral fat in the CR rats was not significantly different from the group that had their visceral fat surgically removed. But the surgical removal group was allowed to eat as much as they wanted. And we can see those effects illustrated in body weight measurements. So when looking at body weight for the 2 groups that were allowed to eat as much as they wanted whenever they wanted, we can see that body weight in ad lib and VF remove were not significantly different as their superscripts are the same. But both of the groups that were allowed to eat as much as they wanted whenever they wanted had a higher body weight than calorie-restricted rats. So to summarize this, for the group that had their visceral fat removed, they had a similar level of visceral fat at 20 months of age to rats that were on CR. But body weight was not different when compared with the ad lib group. So in other words, if visceral fat impacts lifespan, they may be doing it without calorie restriction. All right, so let's go back to the data in terms of the surgical VF removal extends median and maximal lifespan. And that's what we can see here. On the y-axis, we've got percent survival plotted against age in weeks. And then for median and maximal survival, we'll take a look at 50% and 80% survival. This is the time, or these are the times when half the colony has died, 50% survival, and 80% of the colony has died, 20% survival. And for both of those time points, we can see that the visceral fat removal group had significant extensions for both median and maximal lifespan. But they don't have the longest lifespan on this curve. We can see that's reserved for calorie restriction. Now, where I think the story is most interesting is that calorie restriction reduces visceral fat. As I showed earlier, the CR group had the lowest amount of visceral fat. It wasn't surgically removed. So when considering that the visceral fat surgical removal group had about a 20% lifespan extension, both median and maximal, it suggests that at least 20% of the lifespan extending effect of calorie restriction in rats may be due to limiting visceral fat accumulation with age. All right, so these data are in rats. What's optimal for visceral fat in people? And for that, we'll take a look at visceral fat accumulation during aging as it increases during aging, with those plots for women shown on the left and for men shown on the right. On the y-axis, we've got VFM, or visceral fat mass, plotted against age from 20 to about 90 years. And for both women and men, we can see that median values of visceral fat increase during aging. Now, the slopes of these red lines may not seem very high, but to put the data into context, to put this into numbers, So average visceral fat or median visceral fat for a 20-year-old woman is about 200 grams, whereas for a 70-year-old woman, it's about 1,000 grams. So it's a 5-fold increase. Similarly, for men, in a 20-year-old, median values for visceral fat are about 500 grams, and for a 70-year-old, it's about 4 times higher at 2,000 grams. So we can see the visceral fat increases during aging, and not by small amounts, 4 to 5x higher than in 20-year-olds. So in terms of the longevity goal, it's to keep visceral fat relatively low and avoid its age-related increase. So with that in mind, I try to practice what I preach. What's my data? So earlier or late last year in December of 2023, I had DEXA performed, full body DEXA, which assesses body composition, including levels of visceral fat, as shown here. We can see that that was a December 20th, 2023 test. My chronological age was around 51 years, and my visceral fat mass was 0.58 pounds, which is 263 grams. Now, where does that number where can we put that number into context for the curve on the right or for the plot on the right? So for my chronological age, we can see that that's below average, which is a good thing because we want to have visceral fat be relatively low if visceral fat in people can indeed result in an extended lifespan. And we can see that it's below average as highlighted by that green arrow there. Now, where my current levels of visceral fat are would be low for any age. So I can't say that it's the levels of a 20-year-old, but it could be the levels anywhere from a 20-year-old to a 50-year-old. So the goal is to keep visceral fat low for as long as I physically can, and let's see if it'll impact longevity. All right, that's all for now. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon. And before you go, we've got a whole bunch of discount links that you may be interested in, including discount links for epigenetic testing, NAD quantification, oral microbiome composition, at-home metabolomics, at-home blood testing with Cyfox Health, which includes ApoB, but also Grimage, green tea, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch. So if you're interested in wearing the ConquerAging or Diet Trying brand, as I've got on here, that link and all of the other links will be in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.